Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. Today, of course, with me are my colleagues Marek Budzisz and Świdziński, who you know very well, but most importantly, our distinguished guest, Mike Winnerstig from Sweden. I hope I pronounce it at least in proximity of reality. I'm sorry.
Absolutely.
Okay. A distinguished guest, head of Department of Security Policy at the Swedish Defense Research Agency, FOI, a famous institution in the region, chief Swedish think tank, if I may say so, that we closely follow at Strategy and Future, and our subscribers also follow FOI publications. So our guest today is a sort of a face of this sort of institution, if I may say. And today, we will be talking about, of course, strategy and security in the region. And let me start with a very general question, but I think boils down to the critical aspect of today's world. What is the perspective of Sweden, a country that is not on the main peninsula of Europe, that managed to escape the dramatic choices of the Second and the First World War? What is the perspective from Stockholm, from Sweden, on the changing security landscape that is stemming from the rise of China, the relative decline, to be discussed, arguably, the relative decline of the United States, and the Russian foreign policy?
That is a very big question, to be sure, but let me start with the fundamentals, if you wish. It is true that the Scandinavian peninsula is off Europe, so to speak. It's a peninsula, after all, and it's divided from the rest of Europe by a lot of water. That's true. That hasn't stopped us historically, as you know, to go down in Europe fighting pretty heavily in the 17th century in particular. We had a very distinguished period at the time when we kind of, I wouldn't say that the Baltic Sea was a Swedish lake, but it was definitely dominated by Swedish forces at many sides of the sea itself. So we know the Baltic Sea very well. We follow it very closely. We have also been following the developments in Poland very closely, to give you an example. I mean, Poland is a country of the same size as Spain in this regard, in terms of population, that is, and that will eventually lead Poland to be a very interesting partner for us too. The big problem for us for the last 300 years or so has not been Poland, it has been Russia, and Russia alone, I would say. China is a distant threat to us. We have now, the last 3 or 4 years even, began to consider China as a very problematic threat. But it's very obvious to us that Russia is the biggest problem in our own neighborhood. And if you listen to our Minister of Defense, his constant message is actually that Russia is the big troublemaker in this region, and we need to counter it with all means possible, including, well, not all means possible, I will return to that, but with most means possible, and especially in cooperation with other countries, such as Poland and the Baltic states and Finland. This has always been the case since Peter the Greater. So we did manage, as you say, to escape the world wars, but that was more due to the maneuvering of our own government at the time, as they, in the first phase of the Second World War, for example, did provide Nazi Germany with most of what Nazi Germany wanted anyway. Adolf Hitler had no real reason to invade Sweden. In the beginning of the Second World War, about 15 countries in Europe and North America were neutrals. 11 of these, if I count correctly, became invaded or militarily attacked, as in any case. Sweden and Switzerland and Ireland were among the few who weren't. And this is, of course, not due to neutrality, it was due to our geopolitical location and the fact that the Swedish government at the time did cooperate very much actually with the Nazi regime, and then in the 2 last years of the Second World War with the Allies. So we did manage to avoid it, but that had nothing to do with the neutrality, really. The problem after the Second World War, where we kept built up rather, a very big armed force. We had, when I did my military service myself in the 1980s, and I'm still a reserve captain in the Swedish Army, actually. We had about 800,000 troops after mobilization, 30 army brigades, 12 submarines, 55 surface combatants, and about 300 very qualified fighter planes. On top of that, we had also a fully integrated civil society in a warlike fashion, if you wish. All state agencies had their own kind of home guard service, a group of people belonging to the agency, which had arms, guns, and so on in the cellar, the basement of this state agency, in the event of a coup of some kind. The personnel of any state agency should always be able to defend their own building and their own workplace. So in the 1980s, it peaked in the early 1980s, I would say. We had a lot of arms all over the country and a lot of integrated forces, a lot of integrated civil military kind of constructions as well. We were prepared for anything at the time. But then, and we did this, of course, due to the fact that in the late 1940s, Sweden had not decided to join NATO, which our Norwegian and Danish neighbors did in 1949. And that forced us to build up this huge force. I mean, you can compare with the current Polish forces, for example. 800,000 troops is a lot of people under arms. They were certainly not very well armed. They had the rifles from the late 19th century, some of them. They had no real mobility. They were infantry brigades. Half of the Army's 30 brigades were old-fashioned infantry brigades with very little armor, almost no armor at all, old weaponry, and so on and so forth. But they were still there. We can look at the Finns right now. The Finns kept their armed forces very much intact after the end of the after the end of the Cold War. And they still have a lot of brigades, but only 3 or so. These are really modern with up-to-speed equipment. Half of the Swedish army at the time looked very much like what the older echelons of the Finnish army do look today. However, though, given this emphasis on a non-aligned, self-reliant defense, Sweden had a major issue after the end of the Cold War, as everybody else, with the exception of the Finns, took a lot of interest in the peace dividend. We cut down our forces with more than 90%, all in all, in personnel numbers anyway. So now we're down to 2 submarines, 3 submarines perhaps. We're building a couple new ones, but still. We are working on an air force of 60 fighters, perhaps. We have 7 surface combatants and 1 or 2 army brigades. The difference in military posture is gigantic if you compare it with the situation 30 years ago. The thing that didn't change, or which is now changing though, but which didn't change for many years, is the security policy of Sweden. We, or the governments, successive governments of Sweden, were really stuck with the attitude of non-alignment and neutrality. Only in 2003, the major opposition party at the time, the moderates, decided to very carefully proposed that NATO membership might be a good idea. Only in 2015, actually, all the center-right parties of the parliament argued that this is actually a good idea. We should join NATO. But still, around half of the parliament is opposed to that. We saw a shift only a few weeks ago where the Sweden Democrats, which is a populist right-wing party, changed. They have been catering to the voters of the Social Democrats for a very long time. Dissatisfied the Social Democrats, that is, angry about the issue of immigration in Sweden and so on. And for the Social Democrats, being anti-NATO or being not a member of NATO is a religious dogma, more or less. It's an identity thing. They could see any development in the world and they would still say that joining NATO is a bad idea. It doesn't matter really what happens in the world. So when the Sweden Democrats decided that, as like their Finnish colleagues, we should have a NATO option in our security policy doctrine, saying that Sweden reserves the right to apply for NATO membership, period. This was seen as a major shift here, which it really isn't, because that party is still against joining NATO, but they have been softening up, if you wish, their attitude in terms of NATO membership. However, the developments after 2014 with the illegal Russian annexation of Crimea changed the Social Democratic, which is the dominant party in Sweden for a very long time, changed their calculations here. And when they regained power in 2014-15, they decided to change their rhetoric very dramatically in terms of Russia, and they have been doing it ever since, actually. As I told you from the beginning, our Minister of Defense has one message, namely that Russia is the major troublemaker in this part of the world, and we need to counter it together with other countries. This is a big change, because formerly in the Cold War years, there was a mandatory balance here put on politicians. They would never be allowed to criticize the Soviet Union if they not in the same sentence, more or less, also criticize the United States or NATO. Now we're working extremely closely with the United States. We are also working very closely with many other countries around the Baltic Sea, the Baltic states, Finland in particular, but increasingly so also with Poland. To the extent that even if the current Swedish government has a major problem with some of the domestic political directions that the PIS government in Poland has taken, the same government still wants to sell a couple of good, although used submarines to Poland. And that is not something that could have been possible even only 5-6 years ago. But given the developments in Crimea and with Ukraine, Russia has risen dramatically as the major threat for Swedish policymakers, and this is still a work in progress, so to speak. We don't know where it ends. As I said, half of the parliament's parties are now in favor of NATO membership, but half of it is against. This might change given the softening attitude of the Sweden Democrats, but the problem is for the other half, so to speak, the center-right parties, that the view of NATO membership among the Social Democrats in Sweden are so, let's say, non-security policy related. It's a matter of faith, more or less. They recall the 1970s with our then Prime Minister Olof Palme going around in the world to Cuba and Vietnam and other countries, and representing a very left-leaning progressive kind of foreign policy. And they want, some of the people in the Social Democratic Party want to keep that attitude, and that precludes NATO membership for a very long time for them. But things might change, we don't know. That's kind of the general picture, if you wish.
Mm-hmm. And how is that Swedish military posturing? Is getting ready for this new, phase of the international affairs? We noticed some changes, redeployment to Gotland, sort of the boost in the military spending, the debates in the parliament. Here in Poland, we realized the importance of geography of Sweden for the, sort of dispersion. They also pinning down the Russian attention and forces, and actually control of the Baltic Sea depends, given the coastline, on Sweden's attitude. So how is that changing, this perspective from the post-Cold peaceful dividend, the end of history, Fukuyama's, all that, towards this new era of competition that is upon us? In Poland, there is a fierce debate about it.
Well, we kind of listen very carefully to concepts like great power competition. I mean, this was a very obvious foundation of the Trump administration's 2017 national security strategy, for example. And we buy into that by and large. The armed forces in Sweden have been developing their cooperation abilities with Finland in particular, but also with the United States military to a very large degree. We've been working with them for years now, and also in pretty I wouldn't say offensive fashions, but serious fashions. You might recall, for example, I think it was in November last year when we had a major exercise here with American Special Operation Forces from the Air Force, the 357nd, I think, Air Force Special Operations Group based in England. They flew here to Sweden, to mainland Sweden and to Gotland with Ospreys and everything. They were escorted by the Swedish Air Force all the time. They were here refueling, had some rest and recreation, and then they went over the Baltic Sea to Estonia. Still escorted by the Swedish Air Force, but also by a bunch of F-15 Strike Hornets. And the role of these special operation forces was to get down on the ground in Estonia and then be forward air controllers for these F-15 Striker planes, Strike Hornet planes, sorry, that were doing mock attacks on a mechanized enemy, i.e. a Russian one, in Estonia. And this is a major thing. You might recall as well that USS Ross, one of the 4 missile destroyers based in Rota in Spain, were here at the same time. And they all obviously, although that was not really said, but they were here between Sweden and Estonia. And as this is a missile destroyer, they have a lot of abilities when it comes to air defense as well. And they were essentially putting up an A2AD bubble between Estonia and Sweden in order for the Special Operation Forces and the Air Force to do their thing, so to speak. This is a major, it was talked about in Sweden, and some of the old guard here, the people involved in policymaking in the 1970s, they are now pushing 80, obviously. They went ballistic about this, really ballistic, because they saw it pretty clearly as what it was, namely a concerted, integrated effort by the Swedish armed forces, the American armed forces, and the Estonian armed forces to repel a Russian attack, a mock Russian attack on Estonia. This has never happened before, not to this extent, as far as I know anyway. And it's very telling. It tells you that Sweden is acting more or less as an allied nation, but with still a non-aligned partnership kind of status. But for a guy like me who's been, I was young in the 1980s, obviously very young, but still I remember all the religious liturgy, if you wish, about the neutrality policy, how important it was to never allow one country to use Swedish territory and Swedish forces to attack a third country, because that would inevitably kill our policy of neutrality, especially if we did it in peacetime, telling the other party, the third party, that in the event of a war, we will be on your enemy's side. And then you would be attacked from day one as well in a war of any kind in the neighborhood. But we've ditched that right now. We are working with the Americans, with the Finns, with the Baltic states, to a degree anyway, and with Germany and Poland too, very much for the same purpose. And this is a big, big change compared to only the situation 10 years ago.
Marco?
So a few days ago, the Swedish Defense Ministry published the films about the possibility of the war with Russia in the Arctic region. Let me ask you about your risk assessments. Is it a more risky area, is in your opinion the northern region, the Arctic one, or the Baltic, or maybe the both?
Well, we see it normally as one kind of an integrated theater in this sense. I doubt that there will be a war either in the Baltic or in the Arctic that will not affect the other seas, so to speak. I don't know if you would like to put any form of probability calculation here. I doubt that we will have a war in the Arctic before we have a war in the Baltic, but I don't know. It depends a little bit. The Arctic is a pretty complicated place to fight in. It's very cold, for example, which means that you need specialized equipment up there to get anything going, really. So far, anyway. We don't know what global warming will do for us, but still, this is the case right now. On the other hand, though, deterrence worked pretty well during the Cold War, and deterrence still works. I mean, we don't want to see a war here. The thing and the main thrust behind the Swedish efforts, as behind everybody else's efforts, is of course to avoid having a war here by telling the other side that there is no point for you to do anything stupid in this region. And the ability of Sweden to promote or to contribute rather to that deterrence factor is one of the driving forces behind our policy as well.
And speaking of that, Mike, how should we understand what you were just saying? What is the strategic signaling of Sweden? Is the deterrence confined to Sweden, or this deterrence application is sort of extended to the Baltic states like Estonia or something, as we have the mixed signals in that respect, given the posture of the Swedish armed forces? That, by the way, you have mentioned. So how should we read it?
Well, there is always, of course, some kind of a domestic politics underlining of this, if you wish. And that is to say that the armed forces right now, also in their open materials, like the movie you mentioned, as well as in their strategic plans, are now planning for integrated military plans and postures with Finland, and coordinated plans and postures with the United States and NATO, whatever that is in this context. This is from the last governmental bill on defense policy. That's a direct order to the armed forces that they should integrate their military plans with Finland and coordinate their military plans with the United States and NATO, which we have to assume are NATO countries, which could include the Baltic states and Poland, for example. And the armed forces right now have been dragging along very well with that. They don't want to go back, and they can't, by the way, go back to the old days of isolationist non-alignment. As I told you, in the Cold War peak of the 1980s, we had 30 army brigades and a lot of more static and old-fashioned infantry battalions all over the country. Now we have one or at most two brigades. And Sweden is a country of 450,000 square kilometers, plus a lot of water. We can't defend that country with one or two brigades. It's absolutely impossible. We have, again, a small navy too, with a couple of submarines working and 5 or 7 surface combatants. That's not either possible to defend our long coastline, for example. We need to do that with other people, other countries, other armed forces. So the whole point with this is to be able to do that in a deterrence-related fashion. I don't know if you hear any mixed signals in the sense that we should not be able to work with other countries along the Baltic Sea, the eastern shore, so to speak. But I would say that you hear a lot of talk from the armed forces that military cooperation, partnerships, and integration in terms of defense plans, or at least coordination of defense plans, are big things for the Swedish armed forces right now.
Given the geography of the Baltic Sea region and proximity of Poland and Sweden, and coastline, islands, the maritime routes, also the exposed positions of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, in any crisis scenario, in the perfect model, there should be a cooperation between Poland and Sweden, also preventively or preemptively, to sort of have a foothold of certain strategic assets. Like, of course, Scotland has already been redeployed, but there are other places in the Baltic Sea that are of strategic importance, especially in this, regime of anti-axial denial capabilities. And our perspective, even more so, is that takes an offensive mindset in a way, operationally offensive, strategically defensive. Yes, to take things into our own hands. And this political status of Sweden, which is not a NATO country, is always a question mark. But ending my sort of long question, we think that Sweden is the largest asset in the neighborhood in case of any war in the region, by sheer geography. And I just wonder, what is the perspective of Poland, our competence, our size, our military, and most importantly, our perception. So how do Swedes perceive the Polish thinking about such things these days?
Well, you have to consider which Swedes you're talking about here, because generally Sweden is, after all, a fairly liberal society, liberal in the American sense, i.e. left-leaning, when it comes to the role of religion in society, when it comes to issues like abortion and so on. There has been some funny, I have to start with this because it's interesting when you're talking with Poles, some funny things popping up here. When your current government decided to change some things when it comes to law, for example, and the legal system in Poland. In the first place, if I remember correctly, the PIS government decided that judges now should be appointed by the government rather than by themselves. And secondly, the Constitutional Court of Poland was to be changed in one way or another, not abolished, but still changed, being less independent of the government. And there was a lot of discussions about this in Sweden. It was seen as really terrible. How can they do this? This is awful, yada, yada, yada. The thing is, though, that in Sweden, all judges have always been appointed by the government, formally speaking anyway. And we have no constitutional court at all. And this is for political purposes, In the 1970s, when we had our last major constitutional overhaul, there was a debate about introducing a constitutional court in Sweden, and this was struck down by the then Social Democratic government because they did not want to have legal people, lawyers and jurists and judges having opinions about their own policies and being able to veto laws that were considered unconstitutional by the legal people, so to speak. This is an example of how things can be interpreted in other countries. We are accusing Poland for things that we ourselves have abolished a long time ago. That's kind of funny. On the other hand, among professional people in my business, people looking at Poland as a military and geopolitical actor, we have seen for a very long time that the Polish efforts in terms of rebuilding your defenses, investing a lot of money, really a lot of money in defense, Poland is 4 times bigger than Sweden in terms of population, but I believe about as big in terms of GDP, which means that you still have some time to go before you catch up economically with us, for example. But still, you have spent a lot of money on defenses and advanced systems as well for a very long time, and primarily American ones, of course. We do that too, as you know, buying Patriots now, which will be very expensive for us as well. But the thing is that in our circles, or the business I'm in, military and defense and geopolitical analysis and so on, we've always been looking at Poland as a very interesting and very strong actor for the future for the last 10, 15 years, I would argue. And now we have been tasked, more or less, my department in particular, have been tasked to do more with Polish colleagues. This is also why I'm happy to be on your show here. Hadn't the Corona thing being so rampant, we should have been in Warsaw last semester, actually, talking with people and going around to various institutions and think tanks. We've been working on Poland before. We wrote a number of reports on Polish security and defense policy 10 years ago, but that was a long time ago, obviously. So we need to do that. We have a pretty clear view about what's going on in Poland. The problem is here that that part of Polish policy is a bit dwarfed by the other domestic developments in Poland in terms of the current government's actions on abortion rights and what have you. I mean, this is an issue for us to deal with because the attitude of the Foreign Ministry in Stockholm can be very different from the attitude of the Ministry of Defense, for example. My agency and my department are working with primarily MOD money, though, so we don't care about that really, not that much anyway. But it is a concern for us, of course. But on the other hand, we have to look at the realities. Poland is now building up 2% plus of GDP defense force, which will be very considerable. We are not, I didn't say that before, but we are still working on 1%, 1.1% perhaps of our GDP goes to defense. We are, despite all the efforts, not least the PR efforts of our current government, we will not reach 2% of our GDP until 2030 at best. We were going to be 1.5 in 2025 or so, and then we still don't know if we ever will reach 2% within the next 10 years, which is pretty pathetic in my mind. That's my own personal opinion, of course, but still, it is a problem for us. And the thing is, of course, that you are still, I mean, you can count distances in any way you want, but you're closer to Russia, and that means that you put more money into your defense force by nature, more or less. That goes for the Baltic countries as well.
Mm. And what is your assessment of the US presence in Europe? If it is to stay, how do you think? What are the debates in Stockholm and elsewhere across Sweden about the changing nature of the US moment in the history?
Mm. A very good question as well. I mean, I have to start back in 1899 when a Swedish political scientist by the name of Rudolf Kjellén coined the concept of geopolitics. He did that in an article that concerned Swedish borders, actually, but still, he built on German political geographers, and then he realized, or in that article, he develops on the concept of geopolitics, saying that territory, borders, and geographical location are the most fundamental factors for a country. And this goes actually for the United States as well, in a global setting, that is. The main goal of the United States, at least since the 1940s or even earlier, has always been to avoid having the Eurasian landmass dominated by one single country. Be it Nazi Germany, be it the Soviet Union, be it Russia, or be it China. If the entire Eurasian landmass would be dominated or conquered, but anyway, at least dominated by one single country, the United States would be its junior partner, and the Americans don't necessarily want to be junior partners anyway. So what they have been doing is to fight wars and to deter wars for almost 100 years now, with that goal in mind. And that is still the case. I don't believe for a minute that the rise of China, although that is a more long-term and more problematic concern than today's Russia, because today's Russia is much smaller than the Soviet Union when it comes to population and economy. It is not smaller when it comes to nuclear weapons and size. Well, it's smaller in size as well, but still, it's the biggest country in the world anyway. The United States will simply have to face two challengers here, one in the East and one in the West. And this is why I strongly believe, for geopolitical reasons really, that the Americans will continue to be in Europe. They might adjust that a little bit, but even the Trump administration, mind you, and you should know this more than anybody, because the major focus of the Americans during the last 4 years has been Poland, after all. You have been seeing a brigade rotating into Poland. There is a division headquarters and a corps headquarters being built up in Poland, American ones, that is. They will be able to lead major ground operations from Poland. The punishment that the Trump administration directed towards Germany was partly a good thing, partly a bad thing. But the good thing was that they suggested that EUCOM in Stuttgart would relocate to Mons together with SHAPE, which would be a good thing for American NATO interoperability. And as far as I know, they had also thoughts about moving some forces to Poland, but certainly to Italy and so on. So even if China, given its population size and its economy, is by far a bigger, long-distance future threat than Russia, Russia is still the current troublemaker in this region. And especially if you have a situation where Russia and China align, I don't think that's going to be the case, but they could still be partners in crime, if you wish. The Americans need to be here as well. So I don't believe at all that they will, in any considerable way at least, abandon Europe as a theater.
Mm-hmm. Marco?
So let's concentrate a little bit about Russia. In one of the 4 reports published last year, if I remember correctly, maybe year before, there is a conclusion that in 2028, Russia will be able to wage 2 full-scale wars parallelly. Is it mean, in your opinion, that we have the 7 years to rebuild our defense forces to be able to defend ourselves? Or maybe we should go one step higher to create a common system of defense, because there should be not the eastern flank of the NATO, but the eastern front of the NATO, from Arctic to the Black Sea.
Well, that might be what's going on. The report, I think it was issued late 2019, so it's a little bit more than a year now, said that, if I remember correctly, it was issued by my Russian studies people, so I should know it really. But if I recall correctly, they said that they were looking at 2 major regional wars rather than 2 major world wars, so to speak. But anyway, it's a big thing. And they concluded that the Russian forces are being built up right now with that in mind, in a way. Still, I mean, one of the concentration direction actually in the Russian armed forces is the West rather than the East. I mean, they do have a lot of forces in the East as well, but the major concentration, especially in terms of new equipment and educated and well-trained troops, are all in the East. In the West, the Western Military District. However, deterrence works more, perhaps, elegantly these days than what it did during the Cold War. In Germany during the Cold War, we had, if I remember correctly, but NATO as an alliance had something like 8 or 10 army corps in Germany alone along the East-West German dividing line. And that was a lot of people, and they were there on constant alert as well. I don't think we need that right now. We have an small but elegant system of enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states and in Poland. We can easily augment that, but the beauty of that construction is, of course, that it's so internationalized that should the Russians invade Estonia, for example, they would immediately be in a full-scale war with 15 Western countries, including the United States in the long term, just by shooting at their soldiers, so to speak. I don't think we need to put army group after army group along this front, if you call it that. But we do definitely need to be more able to do offensive operations, because that is a deterrent factor in its own right. The Russians will whine about that. And you have to bear in mind, I'm not a Russian specialist. Again, I'm an American specialist, if I am anything. But I've understood from my Russian-speaking colleagues at my agency that many Russians really do believe, honestly, that the West is preparing to wage a war, an offensive war against Russia, as the West has done so many times before in Russian history, including Swedish attacks, by the way. So there is something here. You need to do deterrence policy in an intelligent and elegant fashion. I don't think you need to have a full-scale front along the lines that we had in the Cold War, but you definitely do need to have able and operational and fully trained and educated troops close to the border with Russia.
Albert?
Thank you. I would like to ask, because Sweden has at times, and quite surprisingly, taken a center stage when it came to this US-China rivalry or different kind of issues that China was faced with. And that refers to both the Huawei, but also the bookseller from Hong Kong that later received the Swedish citizenship. So this was sort of, you mentioned, of the moral and value-based positions that Sweden has taken also with regards to Poland. So this is more of a moral component. But then there is the economic one, and that was presented by the CEO of Ericsson a couple of weeks back, when he was commenting on the SAPO, I believe, supporting another agency supporting banning of Huawei. He sent a letter threatening to resign. So you have Sweden being in the center of this, and also in terms of in very economic terms and in very moral terms. So from Stockholm's perspective, from your perspective, what is the nature of the China's rise, the China's challenge, and how should Europe position itself? In particular, Middle European states should position themselves vis-a-vis China and vis-a-vis this rivalry as well.
Well, we do have a problem here. It's a business problem to a very large degree. I agree completely when it comes to now we have a visitor here. Sorry.
That was cool. It looks like a Norwegian cat. I remember.
He is partly a Norwegian forest cat. That's true. That's true. He is a stable cat. Actually, comes from my sister-in-law's horse stable, Icelandic horse stable in the middle of the country. Anyway, we were talking about China and business. Yes. Well, the head of Ericsson has a problem here because he belongs to a generation of business leaders who, for 25 years, have been very used to deal with anyone, anywhere, as long as it's profitable. During the Cold War, I'm told, in the 80s, for example, companies like Ericsson had 15, at least, analysts employed full-time doing what we now would call geopolitical analysis in terms of what they could do, where they could invest, where not to go, given the power struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union and its allies. And there were clear rules for this. You couldn't invest, you couldn't sell computers to Moscow, you couldn't sell radars to Poland, for that matter, during that year. You couldn't do a lot of things. Now, for 25 years after the end of the Cold War, Fukuyama's end of history and all that, Ericsson and other countries have been globalizing. They have been selling anything to anyone, especially China, actually, as it's an extremely big market. And when the Swedish government and the Swedish agencies of the government, which are semi-independent as well, as much as mine is, argued that for obvious security reasons, we don't want Huawei to be part of our 5G network because Huawei is an extension essentially of the Chinese state, which is run by the Chinese Communist Party. Then Ericsson got very disappointed because China is a huge market. They even if they do their own 5G things, they produce a lot of that in China as well. I mean, they have subcontractors in China providing them with all forms of equipment to their own 5G networks, even if it's not Huawei related, it's still partly Chinese. And the business that Ericsson has in Sweden is about 5% or so, I'm told anyway, of the general Ericsson turnover. So Sweden is a very small market, and if Sweden creates problems for China, then China will probably do something bad about Ericsson in China or in the world generally. So they got very nervous, but they didn't get it through. And as far as I know, anyway, the authorities that deal with the 5G thing and rollouts are still not allowing Huawei to be part of it, which has been the case, as you know, in the UK as well as in other countries. Australia comes to mind too, I think. The good thing, though, is that our Swedish business is dependent on Chinese imports and exports to a certain degree, not a huge degree, but a certain degree. But they're far away. They're still far away. It's much easier for Swedish officials to deal with China as a security policy threat as it's distant. Russia is much closer. I return to that as well. And that is what keeps people busy. China is more seen as a business problem here, namely how to not being too dependent, so to speak, on Chinese products and Chinese trade. And you had another question, how should middle-sized European countries deal with China? Well, it's hard to say because it depends on the structure of your trade and so on. But I think, unfortunately, that if this development continues, which I think it will, we will have to return to a world in terms of business, which is divided as much as it was during the Cold War, namely that you cannot do business with all people all the time. You have to choose in a way which market you're working in. We have examples of that already. For example, Scania, our truck company, making trucks very successfully. They have been doing a lot of business with Iran the last 20, 30 years because they have no business whatsoever in the United States. They are immune, so to speak, to being thrown out of the US because they don't have any business there whatsoever. Whereas Volvo, for example, which also makes trucks, have never been interested in Iran because they have a big business in North America and so on. So again, I think this is a business problem more than a security policy problem, but it can still be problematic for us as countries.
Mm-hmm. Mike, as we are, verging on towards the end of the conversation, and the time is ruthless, maybe you'll have some questions to three of Polish colleagues across the Baltic Sea.
Well, I certainly do. I would be interested in seeing, for example, how you consider the Baltic Sea as operational area, what you think about the so-called A2AD threat. It's very close to you, obviously, given the Kaliningrad region, and also the Suwalki Gap thing and your military relations with the Baltic states. I know that you have some kind of connection. If I remember correctly, you have a division headquarters that you share with the Lithuanians or with which the Lithuanians are affiliated. But if you could tell me a little bit more, I mean, in non-classified terms, of course, how you see military cooperation growing with the Baltic states, as well as your Navy's outlook, because my understanding is that your Navy has been the least successful in terms of economic growth anyway of your services.
Gentlemen, maybe I will do it if you don't mind. Okay? And add your comments if feel free to add whenever you want. Of course, again, this is a wide area of questions that you have asked. Let me start by saying that Poland is a land power. And the fate of Poland was always decided on the Northern European plain, not on the sea. And this is why we were fighting the Swedish in the 17th century by using the mobile detachments of cavalry and simply pushing it back to the sea. We didn't care about building a navy too much. We always fielded we were all land power. And increasingly so, given the size of the Baltic Sea and the country's interest. The Baltic Sea is a small body of water. And with burgeoning anti-extraordinary capabilities, the surface fleets are of lesser and lesser importance. You can affect this maritime domain by using the coastal batteries and the aircraft, and you know it better probably than we do. So, and of course, Navy is the most capital intensive and the most expensive branch of the military. So it's useless to invest it in the Navy. Not to mention the Blue Ocean Navy or anything that would be out of the Baltic Sea. Of course, there might be a debate about submarines. Submarines in the Baltic littorals are highly effective weapons, but of course, cost and efficiency and so on. Personally, I am in favor of the submarines and submarines in close cooperation with Sweden, and maybe some interoperability, given that the submarines are a platform that is good for SIGINT and other things, not only the shooting torpedoes, so to speak. So these days, and of course, Sweden has great technology and operational experience in the Baltic waters, which are very challenging for the submarines, and of course for detection of submarines. So this is basically about the maritime domain. About the Baltic Sea itself, this is always of secondary importance of course, we need access to our ports to Gdynia and Gdańsk and Świnoujście and so on, and through the Danish Straits, and this is our vital line of life. But, however, regardless how much we're going to spend money on it, it will be blockaded in case of war. Okay, there is no way that Poland's Navy can change anything in that respect. So that's another reason why we don't invest in the Navy too much. On the other hand, the land domain, this is the domain here. It's the main axis of the continental wars in the history of Europe. Berlin, Warsaw, Moscow line is the most operationalized axis of land operations in the history of humanity. And we need to have field forces. And that's also the answer to your question about the Baltic states perspective. In Poland, there is a growing tension between the NATO commitment and its autonomy in terms of the defense. As geography is ruthless here again, Belarus is the most critical, pivotal place in the geopolitics of Poland. This is the place where the history of Poland was made, destroyed, or won. The same goes for Russia. Smolensk Gate, Bagration, Barbarossa, so many wars, Napoleon, our wars to Russia, 19 of them. It was always decided there. And the future of Belarus is of critical importance. And the First Guards Army is having a pinning effect on the Polish posture, because you can very smoothly deploy across Belarus towards Warsaw. There are no barriers almost. While in the Baltic countries, the terrain is heavy, it's very difficult to move forces. A short line of sight, narrow choke points, forested. So these are completely two different theaters. So, we are facing a dilemma in Poland. There is a NATO political commitment to help the Baltic states, and scarcity of force of Western countries' forces in the Baltic states, that is very disconcerting for us. And the only real land force that could be deployed is the Polish army, while we would need to deploy between Kaliningrad Oblast and the Belarusian border in the narrow, heavy, forested, two-axis advanced terrain that could be by fire maneuver or even troops maneuver completely cut out. Our troops could be annihilated if we are the first to deploy to the Baltic states, and Warsaw would be exposed. So as you see, we are very heavily land domain oriented people in terms of warfare. We need to have heavy force, of course, within the global, integrated joint force arrangement, and we are moving towards that. I think that the Belarusian crisis in the summer of 2020 was a pivotal juncture, because we realized in Warsaw that finally Fukuyama has ended, and it's the balance of power that decides. Mm-hmm. And the Western Europe continental countries don't have muscle, and they don't have determination to influence the balance of power in our neighborhood. So we need to take it in our own hands, and the United States' future is uncertain. And of course, there is a long communication line from the Atlantic coast of the United States through Danish Straits and elsewhere to Poland, which is quite close to Russia. And this is why we think Sweden is a bigger asset than France, Portugal, Spain, even Germany in that respect, because you have real capabilities, understand the realities in the Baltic Sea. Also, speaking of the Baltic Sea, I think that given the nature of the characteristics of or grammar, using the Clausewitz language, of the Russian new generation warfare, that they intimidate, they threaten, they spread, they try to take the initiative, and it's also beyond the kinetic aspect. I think that cooperation with Sweden and some active deployments to multiple islands and also to Huma Sarema on the rotational basis, showing capabilities, coastal batteries, our own anti-access denials, moving the troops, SOFs, maneuvering, and our cooperation with Romania and Ukraine will completely stretch Russians out. I mean, they have no money, they are overstretched, they have so many fronts, they have so many directions, and they are, for the first time in the modern history, they are short of people in real terms. As you know, they are undermanned in the real manpower in the force. And we should ruthlessly exploit it by taking a really offensive stance in that respect in the region. By far, our combined GDP and capabilities are stronger than Russia. Of course, the problem is the nukes and nuclear steps on the escalation ladder, but somehow I think we could talk to the United States to have extended deterrence in that respect, even if they withdraw from Europe in terms of the real conventional firepower. And let me end by saying this. I think that Europe is also at the juncture. It will all depend upon Germany now. And we are watching closely what the Germans will do in terms of the choices between the transatlantic community and this Eurasian landmass, which Kellen was referring to, and others, and you mentioned. I think even if the chief politicians do not understand those concepts because they haven't read Kellen, Haushofer, Mackinder, and others, the reality is forcing them to act in line with those rules. And I think we are at the pivotal moment of the decision, and the decision will be made in Berlin about that. And then the new game will start for Poland and for Sweden too, in my personal opinion.
Well, I agree with most of what you're saying, actually. I mean, Germany is the biggest state in Europe, has always been in a way, I mean, depending on empires and so on. In modern times anyway, and they have a lesson to learn. I was debating, I recall this with some Germans 10, 15 years ago when they had this, the first Nord Stream was up and running. Sorry. And they just couldn't understand that I was telling them that Russia will be problematic again. It's not now, perhaps, but it will be problematic in the future, because already in 2010, you had Georgia 2 years earlier. You saw, we followed their military buildup that Putin initiated very closely. It was obvious back then as well where this was going. It was obvious as soon as Putin took power, more or less, given his rhetoric and his sense of, being a revanchist, having been defeated in the Cold War, now wanting to get revenge, It was obvious, but it was not obvious for the Germans. They bought into the liberal idea, the IR theory, liberal idea of democracy and trade being peace promoting things. And if you trade enough with someone, someone will be interdependent with you on economic terms, and then everything will be fine. And that turned out to be completely wrong. Now do you hear me, Jacek, by the way? I think you're frozen here. Sorry.
I can hear you. I can see you.
Good. You froze here on my screen, but now I see you again. You follow me? What I said? Yeah, good. So I believe that the Germans have a lesson to learn, but the problem is that they don't seem to do that. Right now, they had been obviously the major force behind this China-EU deal, which is the Commission's deal right now in terms of trade, which seems to be pretty terrible in my mind. I haven't been through the details of it yet, but I have asked my people, my staff, to do a brief on this, because we need to find out the security policy dimensions of it, if any. But the Germans were behind this, apparently, and the Germans have a tendency to believe that commercial projects like the Nord Stream 2 now is only commercial and has no whatsoever security policy dimension, which is utterly wrong. And the Americans are telling them this, apparently, but they don't seem to listen. And this is a problem. They might be forced to listen. I believe in what you're saying, that the politicians, even if they don't know anything about geopolitics, they will have to learn on the job, so to speak. And this goes particularly for German politicians. I was pretty concerned when I read the background of the new CDU leader, for example. It didn't sound very good at all, but he might learn on his new job as well.
Okay, gentlemen, do we have the last question to our guest, or Mike maybe is having the last question before we end? Okay, so let me summarize in the following way. I hope that there will be more frequent talks between the Swedish and the Polish experts, as we have a feeling in Warsaw that there will be a fragmentation of this security systems across the world. And, we are really proximate neighbors. You can really walk over the ice of the Baltic, as we did in probably like 400 years ago. I read some records about it. We are really close. And I think for Poland, there are two most important countries in the region. It's Ukraine and Sweden. And this is our grand strategy of the last 500 years. And other are just external actors. Germany didn't exist at the time, and there was no United States. It just came across the oceans. And this is all that mattered in the region. And we are starting to come to grip to the realization that this post-Fukuyama period of the history of the world has ended.
Yes. And it was a fairly short parenthesis as well. It was only 25, 30 years, which is not that much. No, I agree. And we should do more. I hope to do more personally in this regard. When the pandemic thing is over, I plan to take my major project leaders and myself to Warsaw. I hope to see you there. Hopefully before the summer, but maybe not until the early autumn. And we could have a nice seminar or roundtable or whatever discussing these things further. I would certainly enjoy that.
Perfect. So we have the deal then. We are in agreement on that. Thank you very much. Our guest was Mike Winnerstig from Sweden, from famous FOI think tank, and stay with us. Albert Świdziński, Jacek Bartosiak, Marek Budzisz, who has disappeared in the meantime mysteriously. We're running this episode. Thank you very much.
Thank you too. Bye-bye.